Hello and welcome to episode 60 of Driver Seat Blog Radio. As always, I'm your host, David G. Firestone. Before I get into the news this week, I would like to apologize for my lackluster job of talking about the Daytona 500 last week. I woke up on Sunday tired and just not feeling good. I tried to press on as best I could, but the end result wasn't too great. And I've had some stressful issues over the last few weeks, and I've just fumbled the ball, and I'm sorry. I really do like doing this, and I really do want to do my best. So this week we'll start anew. We're going to discuss broadcasting again, because I heard something from a legitimate source that shocked me. So when it comes to a new TV deal, Fox and NBC are in the middle of an exclusive window for negotiation that runs through the end of March, from what I understand. Now, optimistically, experts have said that optimistically the final deals for broadcasting will be ready sometime this fall. Well, apparently Amazon has approached NASCAR claiming that they want a part of the negotiations for their Amazon streaming services. But given how bad the streaming situation is, it seems very unlikely that NASCAR would even remotely consider exclusively streaming a Cup Series, or for that matter even an Xfinity Series race for Amazon. But I will say I think the Truck Series may theoretically be on the table if these negotiations come through. Now, I really hope this is not the outcome, and I really hope NASCAR comes to their senses and tells Amazon to take a hike. I think it's patently obvious now, and it's been for a while, that the streaming service war is over and pretty much everybody is losing. I mean, when every company in a specific industry, maybe with a few outliers, is losing money, that industry is not long for this world. And what you're seeing right now with streaming services, cutting back services, cutting programs off, canceling programs, getting rid of free tiers, increasing advertising, blah, 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 it's patently obvious that the war is over. And it should also be noted that in terms of this story, according to sources, NASCAR's viewership is down since 2015, which was when the last broadcasting deal was struck. So the chances of getting a streaming-only service to sign with NASCAR is low, to say the least. Now, another story that I was going to talk about, but I got sidetracked. Trackhouse Racing owner Justin Marks said something that I was sort of expecting this, but at the same time, I was kind of surprised it hadn't been announced yet. So, he said that Ross Chastain's car from his infamous Martinsville wall ride will be preserved. He said on Twitter, quote, "So the good news is that these cars are strong, and because of that, the Martinsville wall car came back from the race with 90% of its parts reusable, which means keeping the car exactly as it came off the track as a show car would cost Trackhouse hundreds of thousands of dollars. We've gone back and forth on what to do, but given the new ruling made yesterday," this was posted on February 1st, so January 31st, "we've decided to preserve the car as best as possible. Ross's move at Martinsville was a historic moment and should be preserved for the fans for years to come in physical form. This sport isn't just about the balance sheet, it's about the passion, moments, and people." And you know what? End quote. You know what? I like this. I like this approach. I mean, the wall ride is now officially part of NASCAR lore. Preserving the car as best as possible, like many other pieces of NASCAR lore, is an amazing move. With his attempt to get the Skull Bandit on track a few years ago, it's clear that Justin does like to preserve historical cars. I hope that this will end up in a museum someday. And I also hope that Martinsville can figure out a way to save the scrape on the wall, since they've announced that they will preserve the scrape on the wall as long as possible. Now, as much as I hate to talk about this again, we're going to get a bit controversial. I hate it when I'm right on certain things. And I predicted this, even though I wanted to believe otherwise, but it doesn't surprise me. So, Steve O'Donnell, the COO of NASCAR, had stated some time ago that NASCAR wouldn't even consider discussing a second street race until after the Chicago street race was held in case it fails. Well, according to the Sports Business Journal, quote, the sanctioning body is having ongoing discussions with multiple groups in the New York City area and has made several site visits. O'Donnell did not disclose any of the specific groups or possible venues, though MetLife Stadium would seem like one of the potential options, or a street race in the city. McDonnell also cited the Pacific Northwest Series of Seattle and Denver as possibilities domestically for new races. And internationally, NASCAR has, quote, very strong interests, end quote, from entities in Canada and Mexico to bring a Premier Series race to those new countries. End quote. Here we go. Here we go. I knew it. I called it. I knew that the story of not waiting for the Chicago race to happen before exploring other cities was a lie. I knew NASCAR was going to make these moves. I knew it all along, and I wanted to believe otherwise. I really did. I knew the truth, but I was hoping cooler heads and smarter heads would prevail, but they haven't. If you've been listening, I've been talking about all the issues that have arisen or could arise or will arise, and even stuff that I didn't even think of that have arisen, that could prevent the Chicago street race from being a success. The fact is, the clock is ticking. And I don't see any indication from anybody with any power in the upper echelons of Chicago, in the political center of Chicago. I have seen no proof whatsoever that these issues are going to be resolved soon. This is going to be a problem. Because if you're hanging your hat on this race, and Lori Lightfoot is, and that might come back to haunt her, if you're hanging your hat on this race, you need to make sure that everything needs to be at least looked at and analyzed and prepared, and whatever adjustments need to be made must be made. I am seeing no proof whatsoever that even the bare minimum of work is being done in this situation. And if it fails in Chicago, what's to say it won't fail in Denver, in New York, in Mexico, in Canada, anywhere? I've said that it can take years of work to make a race a legendary event, a spectacle, and it can take one bad race to kill off what could be an amazing event. And I say this because I forgot one example in my last list of races in this event, the 1955 Le Mans 24 Hours. It nearly destroyed auto racing in general. Non-electric car auto racing is still banned in Switzerland. And the repercussions of it are still being felt to this day. One tragic event in 1955 almost destroyed auto racing for the entire world. Okay? There is no room for error here. If you get a bad start for this race, it's not going to last. Look at the Brickyard 400, look at Le Mans, look at the U.S. Grand Prix in 2005. There is no margin for error here. But the fact that none of the issues that I've been discussing and that other people have discussing and that have been apparent for some time are not being addressed is kind of telling. But the fact that NASCAR is now hanging their hat on this race like it's the greatest, it's the next big thing in the sport, that scares me. I don't gamble. But I know that if I did, I wouldn't take a bet if the odds weren't in my favor. And right now, the odds are not in NASCAR's favor. This is looking more unsteady the more I look at it. My hope for this race succeeding is dwindling every day. I don't think this is going to work. I want it to work, but I don't think it's going to work. Prove me wrong, Chicago, but that's what I think. Now, in another story that I also wanted to talk about, but I didn't get a chance until today, I noticed a story about Richard Petty, which I found interesting and I think should be talked about. So, when Richard Petty Motorsports became Petty GMS in 2022, and then they became Legacy Motor Club in 2023, over that time, Petty's role in the team changed from sole owner to co-owner to really an ambassador role with the team, respectively. Petty, who I should note is 85 years old, discussed his new role at Daytona. He was asked if his new role bothered him, where he's more just not in charge, but more of a figurehead. He was asked if it bothered him, and he replied with a laugh, "Yes, it does, because I've done things my way, which hasn't been too good lately, but as time progresses, things change in the world." Then it was probably time for a change. Jimmy Johnson's not looking not necessarily at what's going to happen this year, but he's basically trying to lay a foundation for 4 or 5 years where he's still young enough that he's going to be around for a long, long time. I think Jimmy's really looking forward to the future. Basically, he'll wind up running the show in 4 or 5 years. He'll probably be the majority owner of our operation in 4 to 5 years. I know that they're looking at things completely differently. Jimmy's very observant. Jimmy controls everything. Basically, you're making postcards. Postcards and stuff, he has to approve it. He approves everything. He's a very busy man right now. And you know what? I think that with Richard Petty, he wants to retire. I don't think he's going to come out and flat out say that. But he's looking at spending more time away from racing, and I don't blame him. I don't think he's going to stick around for much longer. I mean, he's 85 right now. This is really, I think, the first time he hasn't been super involved in NASCAR or other racing in general since he was a teenager. He's eyeing a real retirement, and he's going to get used to his new position, which I don't think is a bad thing. He can fully retire from the sport if he wants to. He's certainly earned it and certainly deserves it. Nobody is questioning him as a figure in the sport. There's really nobody really seems to be controversial about him. I wish Legacy Motorsports well. I wish Richard Petty well. I hope he does enjoy his retirement. I do hope he sticks around the sport a bit, but he deserves a retirement, and I hope it all works out. Now, with the end of that story, we're going to take our first break. I'll be back with a piece of NASCAR news that I need to discuss in a bit more detail, and it will make sense in just a bit. So I'm back from break. My furry little friend Zoe has joined me. And we're going to move on to the equipment side of things because there was a report from motorsport.com, link in the description, that intrigued me. Because it actually made sense, a question I had some time ago. Now, according to this report, supposedly there will be discussions in the coming years about how either electrification options or hybrid technology can be implemented in terms of NASCAR. Now, as I said, these discussions will start soon. Can't talk tonight. But the path to how these will be implemented is still very murky at best. While, to a certain extent, I believe this is a step in the right direction, I can also understand that the teams and drivers might not be so high on this because of the costs involved. Now, while this is only the beginning, it is a issue. It's an issue that, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's an issue that might not really benefit anybody at all in the long run, because the teams are in a bad spot financially. I mean, that's not up for debate, but reading this, I now know exactly who is to blame for this. NASCAR themselves. Well, why is it their fault, you may be asking? Well, here are some facts. Well, between 2007 and 2023, there were a total of 3 different generations of NASCAR Cup Series cars. Starting in 2007, the Gen 4s were sort of phased out for the Gen 5 or Car of Tomorrow, which again debuted limited fashion in 2007 and stayed until the end of about 2012. Now, while the Gen 5 or Car of Tomorrow was necessary in terms of improvement for safety, and it is the first iteration of Cup Series car that's never had a fatality associated with it, which is kind of amazing if you think about it, it was not very popular with drivers, it wasn't popular with manufacturers, wasn't popular with fans, wasn't really popular with anybody. So that precipitated the Gen 6 car, which debuted in 2013 and lasted until the end of 2021. Now, these were brand new, completely redesigned from the Gen 5 cars, and proved themselves to be very effective. Now we are in the midst of the Generation 7 or next gen cars, and if these current trends continue, these cars aren't lasting 10 years. Now, while these upgrades are necessary, and even in some cases required, you can't argue that it doesn't put a huge financial strain on the teams. Supposedly the Gen 7 cars or the next gen cars will help teams save money, but when you make every team in your entire sport pretty much build brand new cars from the ground up, from the chassis up, ground up, every 5 to 10 years, it's going to hurt financially no matter what. And these cars are, like $300,000, $500,000 each? So any team that has, a driver needs to have like 2 or 3 of these at the bare minimum. Multiple car teams, forget about it. You're spending millions upon millions of these every 5 years for these brand new cars. And because of the fact that less people are watching the sport now than in years past, it's beginning to become clear why many of these teams are facing dire financial straits. I'd like to apologize when I said that the teams should take some responsibility here. They are doing the best they can given the circumstances. And when even the biggest and most powerful teams are struggling, Hendrick Motorsports hasn't turned a profit in years. I can't even begin to think how bad it is for the smaller teams. The fact is that because of this, because of the new cars every few years, they're going out of their way to make the teams and drivers lose money, even though they claim they don't want to, through the needless purchasing of new equipment. Is there any reason that a lot of this new technology that's in the Gen 7 car couldn't have been implemented in the Gen 6 models? Is there any reason it couldn't have happened? And again, you're talking about a chassis, the Gen 7 chassis, that have had to have major modifications done because the cars were injuring people, something that, it did happen with the Gen 6s, but it wasn't as bad as it was with the Gen 7s. Now, whether or not this was their intent can be up for debate, but it's not really relevant, because the results speak for themselves. Already you've had, because of these new financial rules, a number of teams go under. You've had a number of teams that have had to cut back on pretty much everything, and I'll get to that in a bit more. And in a lot of these instances, a lot of costs that cut come in the form of crew members who, they're not just, ASE certified mechanics. These are people who are specifically trained to work on race cars. They're trained to work on the most advanced race cars NASCAR has to offer. Because of various things revolving the upgrades of vehicles, there are a lot of talented crew members who have had to be let go from teams. Not because anybody wanted this to happen, but because of financial and technical reasons. They didn't have a choice in the matter. And in the end, what's really the problem here? Well, it's obvious that nobody's really winning. I mean, that's been clear for some time. NASCAR is struggling. The teams are struggling. Drivers and crew members are struggling, with many crew members having been abandoned. And really, there's no real gain from this outside from advertising and some cool new cars and some new diecasts. I don't think NASCAR should be focused on building another new car for at least 15 years. Let the economic sting of this new car calm down. They're killing the golden goose, but at the same time claiming that they're trying to save the sport and the teams. But with a lot of these economic problems in terms of NASCAR, I hate to break it to you, but very, very little at this point can be done to offset decades of bad decisions and bad implementations and bad policies, other than just letting things simmer and not forcing the issue unless it's necessary. I get that the car of tomorrow was necessary. It was a necessary evil, but it's had to happen. The Gen 6 was an improvement on the Gen 5. The Gen 7 is completely unnecessary. And if teams do go under, I guarantee you it's going to be the fault of the new car. Because you can't just ask these new teams every 5 to 10 years to spend millions upon millions of dollars on new cars for very little in the way of return on investment. The sport right now, if this trend continues, the sport will be in much more dire straits in about 10 years. And it's very, very possible we might see NASCAR go away. Looking at the TV numbers, it's already been down for years. Nobody's arguing that. Again, failed policies and failed implementations. But at the same time, the very company that is charged with protecting the teams, NASCAR, is doing nothing to pretty much benefit them. And I say this, and the thing is, the reason I say that is because, think about it like this. Every team in NASCAR wants a slice of the pie. That's just the way that these sports work. That's just the way sports works. Every team needs a slice of the pie. NASCAR should be wholly focused on the pie itself. Without the pie, nobody gets a slice. And without the pie, we all starve to death. NASCAR has been focusing on the wrong things in terms of the pie, and now the pie is in very real danger of going away soon. There needs to be change. There needs to be new investments. There needs to be a whole bunch of stuff that may or may not happen. I don't know if it's going to, but I hope it does. Change needs to happen now. Well, with that little rant out of my system, now we're going to move on to some other forms of news for other forms of auto racing, and that'll take place right after the break. So now we're into our final segment, and now we're going to discuss some Formula Car news, starting with IndyCar. So they announced on their own website that starting in 2023, Advance Auto Parts becomes the quote-unquote official automotive aftermarket retail partner of IndyCar and Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Okay, that's not really that unusual, but as part of this new partnership, Advance Auto Parts will now become the sponsor of the checkered flag in IndyCar. This one actually struck me as a little bit of odd because in most forms of top-level auto racing, the fuel sponsor is the one on the checkered flag. This was the case in NASCAR when Union 76, now just 76, was on the checkered flags. And it's the case with Sunoco on the flags in NASCAR and many other forms of auto racing where they are the fuel sponsor and provider. Now, as an old school NASCAR guy who has seen quite a few old school races and the gas logo on the flags, it does come off as a little weird. But then again, I'm old school, and also I don't know why I'm complaining about the flag sponsor on the checkered flag. I don't complain about these flag sponsors on the green flag. I don't know why I'm complaining about the checkered flag. I guess I'm just in a grouchy mood today. Okay, so we're going to move to Formula One and the utter train wreck that Formula One has become. For our next story, we focus on their current president, Mohammed bin Sulayem. I don't really care if I pronounce his name wrong because he is a piece of crap. And Sulayem has shown that no matter how bad a company's image is and how bad they look, there's always a way it can get worse. So recently, some old comments made by Sulayem on his old website came to light. Now, in a post from 2001 or 2001, if I could think right now, in one of his posts he said, and I quote, "I don't like talking about money, nor do I like women who are smarter than men, for they are not in truth." Really tone deaf. Really tone deaf. In response to this comment, Formula One had some remarks in his defense because of course they would. In a statement, Formula One said, quote, "He has a strong record on promoting women and equality in sport, which he is happy to be judged on. It was a central part of his manifesto and actions taken this year and the many years he served as vice president for the sport to prove this." I don't know about you, but I don't like the idea of presidents of companies, presidents of sports, utilizing the word manifesto. Given the connotation that manifesto has in this day and age, might want to pick a different term for that. But Sulayem also took flack for suggesting that Formula One was not worth $20 billion in reference to a potential Saudi buyout, calling the number inflated. Dude, shut the fuck up. If the company you're in charge of could be sold for $20 billion and you have a customer ready to pay for it, shut up. Don't fuck up the sale. And again, this is the Saudi government we're talking about, so I don't exactly have a high opinion of them. But good God, how do you say something that sounds so tone deaf to what you're trying to do in terms of a sale? Never mind the fact that all of his comments that I just said were discussed. These comments were met with such universal disdain. The heat was so bad that F1 announced not long thereafter that he was stepping back and taking a less hands-on approach to Formula One. Good. Glad to see him get knocked down a few pegs. Where do you get these guys? Where do these guys come from? How do you manage to pick somebody who, in an era where you've had PR nightmare after PR nightmare after PR nightmare after PR nightmare, do you pick a guy in charge who can make a very tone-deaf stance, make tone-deaf and perplexing stances? And even for 2001, these were amazing. Now, they were tone-deaf in 2001. Now with 2023, with inflation and everything else, they're more tone deaf now. And I've not heard him make a statement on this. Now, I'm not going to spend any more time on this moron than I have to. But, come on. In this day and age, you don't get to make a comment that tone deaf, even if it's in your past, and then just walk away with it. You got to address it. But he hasn't. Now our last story is potentially some positive Formula One news. I know. I'm talking about positive F1 news, but don't worry. See, it's rare in many kinds of sports, let alone Formula One, where every single fan agrees on something. In Formula One, how bad Pirelli's wet weather Formula One tires are is something that pretty much every fan agrees on. There is a reason they are known as safety car tires, because that's how bad they are. With the new season coming up, starting very soon, it was announced that there will be a new and improved wet weather tire. Now, this also follows the announcement of a new compound, as well as Pirelli having homologated 6 dry weather compounds for 2023. We haven't seen any testing or anything about how these new tires will work. But at this point, I think we can all agree that anything will be an improvement. This is another case of, if it's not broke, don't fix it, no matter how broke it obviously is. Nobody in Formula One is arguing that Pirelli's wet weather tires don't suck, because that would be a criminal lie. They do suck. But yet, for some reason, it just seems to be getting worse all the time, and so only now, after the problems become too big to ignore, does the issue get addressed. I mean, do I really need to say anything more than that? Oh, and by the way, you would think, after the death of Jules Bianchi at the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix, you would think that Formula One would be a bit more adverse to using wet weather tires given the circumstances. You would think that Formula One, after the Belgian Grand Prix disaster, would be a bit less willing to use wet weather tires. You would think that, but no. And yet, even with the obvious fact that these tires are not good, they're not mediocre. They're not good, they're not mediocre, they're awful. No one's arguing that. Again, when every Formula One fan agrees that these tires suck, you can take that to the bank. The fact that only now have these critical changes been announced tells me a lot. And I really, really hope that these new tires are as good or better than what they're pledging, because I don't want to even think about what happens if they're not. And I have a feeling sooner rather than later we're going to find out. And I hope we do not find out the hard way, if you know what I mean. I think most of you do. Well, with that, episode 60 comes to an end. Next week is episode 61. I'm Dave Farsley. If you like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.